Hello and welcome to another episode of the Bible in a Year podcast, a resource from Enter the Bible. Journey with us through the books of the Bible, discovering more about Scripture and how it shapes our lives today. I'm Katie Langston.
And I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker.
And today we are delighted to be joined on the podcast by Elaine James. Elaine is a professor of Old Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, author of Landscapes of the Song of Songs, Poetry and Place, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017, and An Invitation to Biblical Poetry, again from Oxford, published in 2021. She's working now on a book that is called The Bible and the Arts of Making, Materials, Ecology, and Aesthetics in the Hebrew Bible. That sounds awesome. Welcome, Elaine. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us, Elaine. So this episode is on the Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon. And so I wonder, Elaine, if you could give us a quick summary or outline of the Song of Songs?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Song of Songs is 8 chapters. It's a short book in the Hebrew Bible, and it contains love poetry, which is mostly in the form of dialogue between a young man and a young woman. You know that because in Hebrew, a lot of the verbal forms in particular are marked for gender. And so you can see the dialogue happening back and forth. There's not a lot of action in the book. And so a lot of it is just sort of a lyrical. Maybe it depends on how you define action. I had a funny experience early on in my career where I was giving a paper on the Song of Songs, and a senior scholar stopped me actually and said, "Well, did they or didn't they?" That was the pressing question. Did they or didn't they? But I think for the Song of Songs, honestly, it's so much. It's lyrics about desire, and so the tension between longing for the lover and longing for the absent lover actually is one. Even though they're addressing each other, they're often also positioned as separate from each other.
Yeah.
And so it isn't so much about what they're doing as it is about that experience of yearning, of longing that characterizes the book.
That's great. And may I tell a brief anecdote about the Song of Songs? Because this is maybe one of my favorite stories of all time.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's your show.
All right. So listeners might be aware that I grew up Mormon, and my younger sister, served an LDS mission in Germany. And when she got there, she noticed that some of the missionaries had some pages stapled together in their Bibles.
Oh, interesting.
And she was like, why do you guys have pages stapled together in your Bibles? And the answer was that the mission president, which is like the guy that kind of oversees all these young people that are, in a foreign country knocking on people's doors or whatever, had decided that the Song of Songs presented too much temptation toward impure thoughts.
Well, I have to say, I've heard a lot of stories about the Song of Songs from my students over the years, and that is a new one. I haven't heard that before. But I will say it has some parallels, in rabbinic interpretation. The Song of Songs, students weren't supposed to read it until they were 30 years old, right? This is a text for mature readers in a sense, because maybe it has some potential to elicit desire. Students of mine now, especially if they come from contexts where, if they're coming out of more evangelical backgrounds, have told me that the main thing they've heard about or from the Song of Songs is in connection with purity culture.
Yeah.
And so, they tell me that the main the most famous verse from the Song of Songs is the adjuration. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and the does of the field. Do not stir up love until it's ready, right? Do not awaken love. And so people have told me that verse is sort of underscored as the important message, right? So,
interesting.
Essentially, like, don't stir up love. until marriage is the
Right.
interpretive context, which of course the Song of Songs doesn't say that, but
Right.
that's what
Right.
some interpretive communities have done to sort of try to tame it, right? It's kind of
Right.
a wild text, and
Yeah.
it's a way of making it safer, I think,
Yeah.
for young people. But I guess the most extreme version of that would just be stapling it so you couldn't read it at all.
Staple it shut. Don't even go there. So then what would you say is a way into the text? Let's say we've got a listener who's prying open the staples, proverbially in their Bibles. What is a way into this book?
I think just thinking with poetry, right? I think if we're looking too much to sort of wrest the moral of the story, as it were, there's a lot of losses, right? Because the Song of Songs is slippery. It's poetry. It's, hard to it's highly metaphorical in its language. So if you're looking for like a straight up life lesson, you're going to be frustrated by the text. But if you are sensitive to the ways that poetry works on people through sound and image, through the sort of luxuriousness of language itself, it's just a wonderfully rich text. And I think, if you need a singular message, it is this kind of like celebration of human experience, including erotic experience. Love is at the heart of the text. And I don't know, I had a friend once who said, well, she's a poet herself. She said, well, you can really only read the Song of Songs outside. And I thought, there is something very true about that. There's a wonderful kind of like richness, even as it's celebrating human love, erotic desire. It's very much set in a pastoral landscape, among the trees and the vineyards and the fruiting, all kinds of fruiting plants.
Right.
So there's a real sense in which like that situation of human love is very much enmeshed in this larger flourishing landscape. And so understanding human sexuality as part of we're creatures in the world, in the natural world, which is also characterized by this kind of like lush potential is one thing to think about maybe if you go outside on a beautiful spring day and read the Song of Songs.
Oh, that's cool. I love that.
Sounds like a good advice. Good advice. So what kind of book is the Song of Songs, aside from a book of poetry? So I know that there's the traditional answer in both Jewish and Christian interpretation through the centuries, and then a more modern interpretation. So what would you say is the genre? What kind of book is this?
Yeah, as you alluded to, this has been a major sticking point in interpretation throughout the song's history, all the way back to as early a record as we have of talk about the Song of Songs, is that it is this text that is apparently love poetry, and yet here it is in the canon of sacred scriptures for both Jews and Christians. And so this posed sort of like a puzzle for interpretation. And over the years, many people have affirmed, in fact, vast majority of interpreters of the Song of Songs have emphasized that it's an allegory, right? It's really about divine love. However, that's configured in Jewish tradition. That's an allegory of love between God and Israel. For Christian readers, they take that in different directions. It's an allegory of God's love for the individual or for the soul, or Christ's love for the church, or even in some Catholic contexts, it's construed Mariologically, right? And so, there's lots of ways in which interpreters have tried to both understand the Song of Songs in the context of Scripture by spiritualizing it. And I think actually that's another way of stapling it in a sense, right? Trying to sort of make it safer for readers. And I think there is still, modern interpreters have wanted to put it very much in the context of love poetry, right? There is no mention of God in the book, or barely a sliver of a mention of God. This seems to be about human love. Really, since the modern period, people have tried to say, maybe these are marriage songs. Maybe this is just erotic love poetry. Maybe this is just totally human and has nothing to do with the religious traditions whatsoever. And that also has wonderful, profound merits for reading and interpretation. So that also should be taken quite seriously. But one thing I think, for readers who are themselves within religious traditions, I do think, you don't have to choose between those two things, because if there is anything we know about poetry of the divine, actually like across lots of traditions and time, it's that erotic love is one of the most powerful ways we have of understanding divine love. And that's not quite, I don't know if it's a human universal, but we see it in a lot of different kinds of traditions. So there is a real sense of like both wisdom and spiritual depth to that allegorical interpretation that I think can still be pretty powerful, even while acknowledging that, every word of the song or every verse of the song doesn't have to be map onto a specific allegorical meaning. And that it dignifies, you can't have the dignification, is that a word? You can't dignify divine love through human love without profoundly dignifying the experience of human erotic love. So I think that is also one of the powerful takeaways and the testaments to the Song of Songs within the scriptural traditions.
So I hear you saying it's a kind of both and, or can be a both and, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I love that about poetry, right? Why would it not be both? Why would we have to choose? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree.
And a lot of mystical writing is very, can read very erotically in a way, there is, that tradition as part of it. And so I think kind of your point about these things coming together in a lovely way is important, and something that we kind of overlook or neglect in our squeamishness, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah. In the medieval period in which we have this like massive outpouring of writings on the Song of Songs. I mean, it's one of the most commented on texts in the Christian tradition by far.
Wow.
A fact which people who staple it closed maybe don't want to fully acknowledge.
Right? Yes, exactly.
But yes, they are the engine for that huge outpouring is this really deep sense of mystical potential, right? Mm-hmm. There is this kind of like sense that God speaks to us through these words and we speak to God with these words. And that is, wow, pretty erotic and pretty powerful. That ought to make us feel a little squeamish. I think if it didn't, then maybe we're not taking it quite seriously enough.
Yeah. I like that. Well, it's time now for our favorite part of the episode, which is to play Bible Bingo. And Bible Bingo is when you've given us 5 concepts, words, people, places, context, phrases, something like that would be on your bingo card as you read through this book of the Bible. So we'll kind of do this in rapid-ish fire succession. The first is love.
Yes, love. Love is everywhere in the Song of Songs. Literally, the word love is everywhere, but also the sense of romantic connection, of desire, as we've said, of erotic longing. This is the centerpiece of the Song of Songs. However, in the very power of love itself is the thing to think about when you're reading the Song of Songs.
Lovely. Wine.
Yeah, wine is a lot of places in the Song of Songs too. So this points to this sort of like
this is a great book.
This sort of like the headiness of the Song of Songs. Wine and its associations with feasting, with banqueting, with luxurious sensory experiences is central, right? The friends say to the lovers, eat, friends drink, and be drunk with love, right? There is this kind of like sense that wine, both as like a material thing, an actual physical pleasure, as well as this profound metaphor for what it means to taste, right? To take something into your body, to experience its pleasure. And it's also a way of thinking with the metaphor of the vineyard, because throughout the Song of Songs, it's the woman herself is metaphorized through the vineyard, right? She is a vineyard and it's grapes. And so the idea of the drinking and enjoying wine also becomes this metaphor for the enjoyment of the lover's body, but it also has this wonderful ecological potential, right? Wine was the product in the ancient world of the whole community. Grapes are like very vulnerable crops and they have to be harvested right away. And when they are, it's all hands on deck. And so it's a whole community coming together to make a product that would preserve these grapes over time for the enjoyment of the community, which is also a wonderful way for thinking about how we might understand love, right? It's not just an individual thing, but it's part of the flourishing life of a whole community.
Right. Yeah. Everyone's better off when people love each other, when couples are, healthy and loving. And yeah, it's a community thing, not just a personal one-on-one. I like that a lot. Next, you have garden.
Yeah, well, this continues my ecological theme. The Song of Songs, in many ways, is a garden text. There are gardens referred to in the Song of Songs. There's a beautiful poem at the center of chapter 4 that describes this garden and all its lush plant life. And this, too, is one of those things that sort of like connects up people with a flourishing landscape. If anyone is gardeners who's listening, have maybe some ideas about what that means, right? What it means means to both be responsible to plants and to try to cultivate them and to cultivate their flourishing, and what a tenuous exercise that is, and how vulnerable the gardener is as well as the plants are. That's a helpful thing to keep in mind, especially because, if you're thinking about the pastoral context of an ancient subsistence community, right? This is very different from modern experience in which we're much further removed from actual landscapes. But if you think about how closely lives were lived to both working the soil and, literally gardening and pasturing flocks, for example, it helps to understand more richly the Song of Songs. So I think the garden is a really important part of that. And it's also a beautiful space, right? This is metaphorically another one of those powerful metaphors for love itself.
I wonder, I've read Phyllis Tribble famously, and of course Ellen Davis, think about the garden and the Song of Songs as a kind of return to the Garden of Eden. I'm just curious if you, or a redemption of the Garden of Eden. Do you see any connections there, or?
Do I buy it? I think that you have, there is one place in the Song of Songs where you get what feels like a clear allusion where, she says, my beloved is mine and his desire is upon me, right?
Yeah.
Or is over me or is for me or something like that. And that seems to be a clear inversion of that punishment text that we get in Genesis.
Yeah.
Is it an actual reversal of the Garden of Eden? I'm not so sure, right? I mean, the Eden story is a story about potential and loss, and the Song of Songs is a story that's mostly about potential, but it too is tinged with hardship and loss. We remember in Chapter 5, the woman is beaten by the guards, right? Not having the lover, not being with the lover. She goes out in search of him, and she is stripped and she's wounded, and she talks about that. And so in that sense, the Song of Songs is not fully an idealized landscape. And Phyllis Tribble's reading, and I think this is true actually of Ellen Davis's reading and some others who have read this as a reversal or sort of a return to Eden. I don't know that they take those contexts of hardship quite seriously enough. And I think that I would be, I wonder if we can have a reading that is wonderfully celebratory of love and its potentials, and also pretty sober about the realities that women face abuse and hardship, and that is physical and often sexual, and that is also part of the landscape of human love. And it's not a celebration of those facts at all, but a kind of a sober witnessing to them.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Voice.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, this is part of the song as lyric poetry, which is we don't get a story in the Song of Songs. We get this kind of immediate immersion into the voices of lovers. And so lyric poetry, in my view, is an opportunity to pay attention to voice, right? We have to ask ourselves, who is speaking and what's, you have to sort of imagine yourself into a scenario. A lot of interpreters have really wanted to find the narrative, find the plot, find the story, find the characters. In fact, you have both all the way from, ancient interpreters all the way up through, you can still find contemporary folks doing this in their translations and interpretations, imposing a plot and making sure we know who all the speakers are and telling us the story as it unfolds. And I think actually that's not the right way to read the Song of Songs because it resists those readings. In fact, it's the voices themselves, it's listening to the voices that characterizes the experience of the Song of Songs. And so just being sort of okay with that the voices come a bit unmoored. And so you have to sort of embrace them and listen to them in that way, remembering that the lovers are also listening to and for one another. They're also hearing the sounds of singing, the song of birds, for example, the sounds of gazelles outside the window. All of these sounds are things to sort of like pay attention to as they draw us into this beautiful landscape of love.
Cool. And finally, look! Exclamation mark.
I did. I put, look, exclamation mark. Because in Hebrew, hine, which means look, I think could have an exclamation point.
Yeah.
You do get this kind of, I was just talking about voice a minute ago, right? Which is that auditory sensory perception. But we also get the perception of visual, especially visual beauty. We get a celebration of beauty in the Song of Songs. So we look and we see and we hear and we experience. It is a kind of like it calls the reader to sort of be alert to beauty and love in the world around us all the time. And even the description of the lovers' bodies. So the young man describes the woman in part, not quite from head to toe, but describes her face and bust, and then one time describes her from toe to the top of the head several times. And the young woman describes the young man one time, also from head all the way down. And so there is this pretty deep sense of that, looking at the lover's body is also part of this beckoning to the celebration of love in the world. Some people have said maybe that's an exploitative gaze. Do we have the male gaze here? And I think, it's a more participatory kind of experience that we have. And as actually Cheryl Exum at one point nicely says, the bodies are themselves cloaked in metaphor. So it isn't so much an exploitative gaze as it is, I think, an attempt to say something meaningful about what it's like to be in the presence of a beloved other. Which, anyone who's been in love might recognize this feeling,
right?
That feeling of being sort of put off center by beauty itself.
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. You have won Bible bingo.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. So next question, and it's maybe a little redundant given our conversation, but what's weird or interesting about the Song of Songs?
Oh, so many things are weird and so many things are interesting. Your hair is like a flock of goats. I can't say that I've ever, wished for a lover to say that to me.
I'm not sure if my husband pulled that out. I'd be like, really? Okay.
Yeah, there are plenty of things about the Song of Songs that are a little weird, a little grotesque. Fiona Black argues that they're even a little bit grotesque. And that weirdness is, I think, okay. Partly it's a cultural distance, right? So we're talking about, as I said, an ancient, pastoral, agricultural, agrarian subsistence society. So tending for flocks, for example, would be a mainstay part of many people's lives. And so the sight of flocks coming down the hillside would probably evoke a whole range of feelings, actually, that we have to sort of imagine that as modern readers who are quite removed from that context. On the other hand, love poetry can be weird. I think that's true in any body of love poetry that you read. And that's part of the appeal. If you just have common images like, oh, my love is like a red, red rose, that gets, how many times can you say that? Well, it turns out you can say that a lot of times because a lot of love poetry does say that. And there's nothing wrong with traditional or stereotyped imagery. And a lot of this language, given how it repeats in the Song of Songs, and, it's not unknown from other bodies of ancient love literature that we have. It too is full of stereotyped images. And yet love poetry also has a way of drawing on, sort of whatever is at hand to try to make sense of and describe that experience of love. So yeah, the imagery is pretty weird. It is weird that the Song of Songs isn't about deities. So a lot of the bodies of love poetry we have in the ancient world are actually about deities, either about deities in love with each other or deities in relation to royalty. And what you get in the Song of Songs is not that. And so the absence of an expressly named divine figure in the song also makes it kind of weird in the ancient world. Perhaps our best parallel is the New Kingdom text from Egypt, even though those love poems are quite distant in time and space. Others have argued more recently that, we should look to Hellenistic parallels, that this is a text that comes to ancient Israel under the influence of Greece. That's not impossible in my view. But it is weird for texts in the Bible. And it's also, it's kind of weird for love poetry in the ancient world. So it's kind of a cool fact to roll around in your mind, right? It's an interesting thing that we get in the Song of Songs. It's not like a lot of things. It's like a lot of things, and then it's not like a lot of things. So you got to sort of wrestle with both of those facts.
Oh, that's cool. We had talked about this a little bit when you said that in the Middle Ages, it was, a time maybe the most commented upon book. But how or why has this book been important in Christian life and theology?
Well, it's mostly been important, as you note, for that allegorical interpretation, right? This tells us something about divine love. And I think there's, as I said, there's definitely merit to that. But also there are a lot of things that the Song of Songs does that are still worth reading, even if you're not following a strictly allegorical interpretation. As I said, this is a text that's not like other texts in the Bible. One of the things that it does give us is the voice of a woman, which you don't get a whole lot of in biblical texts.
Right.
So for non-male readers or for female-identified readers, this is kind of a big deal, right? This is a text that should give some merit in that it values the voice and experience of a woman in love, right? In that sense, bodies and embodiment are also foregrounded, and not in a toxic way. Most of the texts we have about sex in the Bible are pretty bleak, right? They're pretty bleak. It can be hard to read, right? They're pretty regulatory. We have stories of rape. There are not a lot of texts that you could think of as sex positive. If you have anything like a sex positive text in the Christian tradition, in the canonical texts, the Song of Songs is it. And I think in my mind, that in and of itself is one reason that the Song of Songs should be more important in contemporary Christian life and theology. As I've mentioned here and there over the course of our conversation, I think it has a lot of ecological potential also, right? It helps us imagine sympathetically and connect to a larger landscape that includes plants. There are some of the highest density of plant names in the Hebrew Bible occur in the Song of Songs, and other creatures as well. So you get all these glimpses of a more, a world that isn't just about humans, but that is about this flourishing landscape that's so much bigger than ourselves. And finally, I just circle back to that it's not about deities. I do think one thing that's really worth recovering that the Song of Songs witnesses to is this kind of like everydayness of the experience of love, right? A lot of biblical texts are these, really amazing experiences, and they're hard to imagine. There aren't, I think, a lot of us who have an experience like Abraham of being called by some super compelling booming voice and then feeling the need to follow.
Right.
Those things for most of us live our lives in sort of the day to day, where we're thinking about the people that we love and the things that we're responsible to. And the Song of Songs, it's like having a glass of wine, right? This isn't something that is altogether unusual, but it is a fact of sort of normal human life that is also precious, also worth celebrating and cultivating and emphasizing. And that is also part of the beauty of the Song of Songs, is this call to just the beauty of the aesthetics of everyday experience.
I love that.
I love that. Yeah. The call to everyday beauty, and to pay attention to that, and to recognize it as gifts of God.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's one key theme that you would want readers of the Song of Songs to look for as they enter into the text?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I think it's that last point, the celebration of life. When I teach the Song of Songs, I often say that to students. This is a song that is a celebration of life that calls us to embrace the world and our lives in it. And what would happen, I asked them to do this thought experiment, what would happen if you put the Song of Songs at the center? This is a text that's been quite marginal or marginalized in the Christian theological traditions. What would happen if we took a cue from those medieval interpreters and moved it back toward the center of religious or theological experience? What would shift? What would change? How would our perspective be opened up? And one thing that it does do is create that space, as I said, for really embracing passionately life in this world.
Yeah. I really like that.
Thanks, Elaine.
So always our final question, describe this book in 7 words or less.
Okay, I would say the song it's pastoral, erotic poetry with a rich spiritual history. How many words is that?
I think that might
Close
be
enough.
7 or 8. Perfect.
8.
Close enough.
Okay.
Close enough.
Really good. Thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for joining us. We really appreciate hearing your wisdom about the Song of Songs. It's been a delight to have you as a guest on our podcast.
It's been just a delight to have this conversation. Thank you so much for the invitation. I hope it's an invitation to readers to pick up, maybe unstaple the text and go outside in the springtime and remember how beautiful and miraculous a gift it is to be in this world.
That is a beautiful way to end. Thank you to Elaine James, and thank you to those of you who are listening or viewing this. This has been the Bible in a Year podcast from Enter the Bible. Check out more great resources on the Bible at enterthebible.org. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching YouTube, We appreciate your following with us. You can get more great resources like this. Again, conversations, reflections, commentaries, courses, anything that you would need as you dive in and enter the Bible with curiosity and faith. If you enjoyed this podcast, as always, please rate and review or like and subscribe. And of course, the very best compliment you can pay us is to share this podcast with a friend. Until next time.